Hello, this is the next instalment in the podcasts around the Ogham. For this one, is that clear there? Ooh, ish. We're going to talk about the one at the top there, Uath, which is the letter H in the Ogham alphabet. Um, it's a letter that, in early Irish as such, there was no letter H, but certain words, when you join certain letters together, you get a ch sound. And it's that kind of aspirated sound that it represents, but that's a linguistic thing that probably won't be of awful lot of interest to people. The usual translation given for Uath is the hawthorn tree, or the whitethorn, may tree, whatever you want to call it, various different names. But the word per se doesn't actually mean that. The more literal translation of the Gaelic word is terror, or horror, fear, being shit scared, basically. So a bit of a grim run to start the second of the Ogham, the second set of 5 letters. In terms of the various bits of symbolism that go with the terror, fear, the bird Ogham is Hade, which translates as night raven. Now, it's not very clear in terms of the translation quite what a night raven is. There are no nocturnal ravens or crows or other corvids. There's none of them that are about at night. Could it be night in the sense of colour? The colour of the bird being very black, which obviously doesn't exactly narrow it down. Lots of corvids are black, basically, crows and ravens and what have you. So quite what bird, whether it's an actual type of raven, or a bird that simply looks a little bit like a raven that was referred to as a raven, or indeed it could be some mythological bird that doesn't exist in actual zoological lists, but is some fantastical creature which was known by the early Irish, but has not survived the translation of stories into the modern day, because if it is a mythical bird, a legendary fantasy creature, then it's not one that's widely known about these days. So that's not, frankly, terribly helpful as an element of the Ogham law to look at. However, the raven or crow or various related birds are often associated with death. In a lot of cultures, they're seen as birds who are emblematic or omens of death. If one of them flies into your house, somebody in the house is meant to die. That's a common country law in many places, which kind of fits with the idea of terror and the anxiety many people have around dying. So it sort of goes in with that, even if we don't know exactly what that creature was, that type of bird was precisely. The colour Ogham is Huathe, the same thing, which as a colour just means terrible. Now, it's one of those colour Oghams that's not easy to translate into a standard modern notion of a colour. We have no such colour in English as terrible. So quite what is it? Could it, for example, refer to the colour that a rotting corpse goes, that kind of manky, mouldering green, which would be quite terrible and horrible to look at? Could it refer to the state somebody goes when they are in a condition of horror? So if you have at least a standard European face in Irish face, somebody who's horrified and shocked, the pallor, the blood drains from their skin. And certainly one of the word Oghams is blanching of face, to go very, very white when you're horrified and shocked and sort of terrified by whatever it is that's happened to you. So that kind of fits with that, and it may well be a very drained white kind of colour. There are the Birchbeich barn is also white, and there are other references to the same colour cropping up, but perhaps different shades of the same colour. Certainly if we're thinking in terms of the tree, the hawthorn tree has white flowers, so perhaps that's all sort of moving around a theme there, and in that line. I can't find any references in any surviving poems that I've come across, or in any of the translated myths I've encountered, in which some item of clothing or a person's appearance or what have you is referred to as Uath, is referred to as being terrible of colour, which could simply be because I've not come across that story yet. or that it's just not something that's cropped up as a significant symbolic issue in mythology. Number-wise, this is the 6th letter, and we can think of 6 in a number of different contexts. There is an association in astrology with the planet Venus and the number 6, but we know virtually nothing about early Irish or any kind of Celtic astrology. So it would be difficult to say that the Celts definitely associated number 6 with the planet Venus. But within Greek astrology, it is associated. It's also linked symbolically to bees, because obviously the bees make their hives, and their honeycomb, sorry, the honeycomb, not the hive, is made in a hexagonal pattern, hexagonal shape, and bees have 6 legs. So there is a positive association there. Bees, honey, often tie into Venus and love, and you know, so the sweetness of love and all of that. But that doesn't sit well with the idea of fear and terror. So how we interpret the number 6 in a Celtic context, or at least an Irish context, is somewhat open to debate. There are very few, if any, things that crop up in groups of 6 going around in Irish mythology. So again, there is a dearth of surviving information on that one. So on to the word Oghams. We've already mentioned blanching of face as one. Another is a pack of wolves, terror to anyone, which goes well with the fear image. And it comes up those sort of Hammer horror films of the wanderer walking through the woods late at night and suddenly, oh! There's all of the howling in the woods from the wolves or the werewolves or whatever it is in the film. That would be quite a terrifying thing to listen to. Now, I adore wolves. Going down to the wolf sanctuary at Reading, back when they were open to the public, and just sitting there with my eyes shut, listening to the wolves sporadically howling. They don't do it on cue, obviously. Sometimes they don't howl at all, but on those occasions when they do, to me, that is absolutely wonderful. But common sense comes in. Imagine we're in an Iron Age hut, a roundhouse. It's dark, there's no street lighting, there are no electric torches or any of that, and you suddenly start hearing the howling of wolves. You might well panic. You might worry that they're going to come and eat your goats or something. Wolves very rarely raid human habitats unless they're extremely hungry in very, very harsh winters when the wolves are half-starved. But it's exceedingly rare for a wolf to ever attack human habitat. But if you've got sheep up on the mountainsides, that kind of thing, then wolves will predate occasionally on more isolated livestock. But if that livestock is the difference between your family eating and your family starving to death, and a wild animal, be it a wolf or anything else, comes along and eats it, then that would be a frightening thing, or the sheer threat that you can hear those predatory animals walking around in the dark and you're worried, oh God, they're going to eat my one surviving sheep, and that your family will therefore starve to death. That would be quite a terrifying thing, I can easily imagine. Why do wolves howl? Well, perhaps the sheer joy of doing it, singing to the moon and being all very romantic and poetic, but just as likely it is communicating with other wolves. And a large part of that communication is liable to be territorial, to effectively say, this is our patch, you lot, you other wolves, stay off it. So it becomes a sort of protective practice, a way of deterring other wolves from intruding on their territory. Doesn't mean they don't howl about other things. I'm sure they have lots of wolf songs conveying different messages on different occasions. But territorialism is one of those messages, undoubtedly. And that fits well with the image of the hawthorn, which of course is chiefly used as a hedging tree by humans to create hedges around fields and so on. It being so very densely growing bush, covered in thorns, and so not a very pleasant thing to try and clamber your way through unless you want to be cut to ribbons. Good for keeping not only the wolves out of your field, but the sheep in your field. So any barrier serves a twofold, keeping something in as well as keeping something out. It's a protective, defensive wall. And the tree itself has thorns, usually on the lower down branches, much like holly is prickly on the lower down leaves. Those thorns are there as a deterrent to creatures who might want to chew the plant, chew the tree, not the plant, and bite lumps off the branches and have a munch. It's a way of saying, don't eat me. in effect, a bit like caterpillars with leery colourings are saying to birds, I'm poisonous, don't eat me. It's a defensive mechanism, like the wolves howling. So symbolically in readings and in chanting and all the rest of that, Huathe is fear, but fear used as a defensive mechanism. If you can scare the other person off, or the predator off, or the burglar off, whoever it may be, then in effect you don't have to have conflict, because conflict only happens when they're not scared off, when they do break into your territory, when they do come after you, and then you've got to have some kind of direct conflict with them. They'll get hurt, or you'll get hurt, or everyone will get hurt. Whereas if you can scare them off of coming in, like a burglar who sees a burglar alarm and thinks, well, I better not break in there, then that is a deterrent technique. And so this has that kind of quality of deterrence. So cropping up in a reading, it could be used to suggest this person needs to strengthen their barriers, whether in the sense of getting a better burglar alarm so they don't get robbed, or in the sense of their personal boundaries because they're being used, abused, exploited, what have you. Maybe they need to put up a wall to keep others at a distance and stop those others intruding and interfering and exploiting and abusing them in some way. There's an interesting aside that the Canadian psychologist Jordan Peterson makes in one of his many speeches. He seems to give a hell of a lot of them. He talks about the need for, well, he's talking about men, but I'm sure it applies exactly to women as well. That if you are fierce, you look grim, you're less likely to be walked over. Whereas if you appear a meek, timid little thing, then anyone of a predatory turn of mind is going to use you as a doormat, walk all over you and take advantage. So even if you are never likely to thump anyone, if you at least look as if you might be capable of it, you look grim even if you're a pussycat underneath, you have the outward appearance of being a dangerous character, then those who are of a certain unpleasant mentality will respect that, and perhaps it will deter them from getting in your face and getting intrusive or exploitative or whatever. And so there is a risk if you are too meek and mild, in that whilst nice people will not abuse you, horrible people will. They'll see that as a kind of like sharks sensing a wounded fish thrashing about in the water. They'll home in on that and predate upon you. So in a reading, it could signify that this person is maybe vulnerable to exploitation, and they need to put up a stronger front to deter those who would exploit or abuse or eat them. So an aspect there. Another of the word Oghams is a meet of hounds, whitethorn being another name for the tree. The word that's translated as hounds can also be translated as wolves, or meeting of wolves, meeting of hounds. Very similar theme again. The coming together of the pack. And that kind of conjures up images of Gwyn ap Neath, the Welsh deity, whose name means white. Again, Gwyn, white, Huathe, deathly pale, blanched, echoing the themes there. And his Irish counterpart, Finn McCall. The two, Gwyn and Finn, mean exactly the same thing, one in Welsh, one in Irish. Both figures are hunters. That's a central recurrent theme, and they probably both stem from the ancient British deity Vindos, the white one, the blessed one, the pale one, who is a god associated, we don't know an awful lot about him, but there are a number of healing springs where people went for the healing waters, and as was common in ancient British and ancient Gaulish times, would leave little clay shapes representing the bit of their body that needed healing. So if they had a manky leg, they'd leave something that was leg-shaped. And the common thing to be left at the shrines of Vindos are clay eyes. So people who were going blind or had eye infections, or one thing or another wrong with their eyes, glaucoma or what have you, would come for healing treatment for their eyes, because he was associated with far-sightedness and clear-sightedness. Now, we can just read that as a straightforward biological thing. Or we could also suggest that to be far clear-sighted and be able to see a long way ahead is certainly a very useful skill if you're a hunter, and you can track your prey from quite a distance. So to be clear-sighted in that sense, or likewise if you're an archer or you're throwing a spear or any other kind of projectile weapon, then a really good eyesight is a key there to have strong aim. So if we're thinking of that in terms perhaps of divinatory elements again, we could say to have a clear sight upon your goal, to be able to look far ahead, not just in terms of distance and geography, but in terms of the future, to see what the future holds, to look into the future, to see where you want to be in a year or 5 years or whenever, and to aim for that, like an archer taking aim at a target, then you are on track for what you want to achieve. You've got far sight, clear vision, strong aims, all of that kind of related palaver and imagery. All sorts of layers into one. And I can imagine that would also be quite frightening in a sense. If we're going for the fear imagery, you're whatever you are, a farmer or something, you're just going about your daily duty, and all of a sudden arrows start flying out of the blue. You can't see who's shooting them. Or in this day and age it'd be guns and bullets, wouldn't it? But back then, arrows or spears. That suddenly missile weapons come out of the sky, and you've got no idea who's lobbed them or where they are or where the next one's coming from. That would be quite frightening if the first one doesn't kill you outright and you're trying to flee to safety and you don't know which way to run in. So perhaps, I'm stretching it a little bit here admittedly, but there's an element of that perhaps. The last of the word oghams is most difficult at night. So you could understand that in a variety of contexts. That, obviously going back to the idea of wandering at night without benefit of street lamps and such like, your chance of tripping over tree roots and smacking your head off low-hanging branches is quite high. You'd have accidents and injuries, so if you had any sense whatsoever, you would not be travelling at night, except perhaps at the full moon, when you had enough, hopefully, light to see by. But if it's a cloudy night, even that would be risky. So anything becomes more difficult when you're in the dark and you can't see where you're going or quite what you're doing. And avoiding all the obvious innuendos on that one. So that it kind of suggests perhaps the need for caution, the need to tread carefully, just as if you were walking your way through a forest of hawthorn trees with all their thorns, you would need to be very careful not to get scratched and torn and blinded on one thing and another. So you would have to move very cautiously, very gently. There is an Irish story about the Finn McCall and his Fina, the warriors, a sort of Robin Hood setup, in which those auditioning is the wrong word, but applying to join the band of super clever, super skilled warriors and hunters and whatnot, one of the things they would have to do as they're running was to take a thorn out of their foot. Presumably somebody shoved the thorn into their foot earlier. Take the thorn out of their foot and keep running without stumbling or tripping over themselves or what have you, to be that agile, that speed. Now, whether anyone ever actually did that, or this is just one of those sort of apocryphal stories that get told as an example of extreme skill, probably the latter. But the notion of thorns as a dangerous thing and a trial to overcome, it all fits fairly obviously in that. There are a mention of wolves in various Irish stories, which we could touch upon, and they're usually seen as scary, frightening things, but also as symbols and reminders to humans of the importance of loyalty and banding together. So we have the stories of the Deburga. The Deburga are outlaw bands that go about, and sometimes they're raiding communities and stealing everything in sight and killing people and what have you. But they can also be hired. So if you think a little bit like a kind of ancient Celtic version of the A-Team, the Deburga were mercenaries for hire. So if you had the cash and you said, well, I want you to go and get vengeance on that person who did me wrong, or those people over there have kidnapped my daughter, can you go and rescue her? And this has happened, that's happened. I want you to come in and use your muscle and your might and your military skills to do so-and-so thing for me. Then you pay them and they go off and do it. And they bring you the severed head of your enemy, or they rescue your kidnapped daughter, or whatever the palaver is. And they are, one of the referrals to the Deburga is that they are a band of wolves. And so whilst in Nordic sources, in Norse poetry and mythology, people talk about going a Viking, to Vike, to become a Viking is to go off on a raid. So the Irish sources talk about a wolfing. Let us go a wolfing. So let's go and join the Deburga and become mercenaries and be swords for hire. Certainly there's the story of Dodurga's hostel, where various people are holed up, besieged in this large building, and there's a band of the well, quite a big band of the Deburga outside this building. It's two rival um, chieftains who are at each other's throats. One's holed up inside the building, and the other's got his Deburga outside the building. And they're about to besiege and kind of fall down upon this building and set light to it and smash the doors off the hinges and all the rest. And the warriors start howling. So you can imagine it's late at night, you know that there are all these warriors out there, they're banging their swords on their shields, and they're throwing their heads back, dozens and dozens of them, howling and howling and howling, and you know they're about to slit your throat at any minute. You would probably shit yourself. It's a frightening scenario. So that idea of wolves working together to bring down stronger prey, which is what the Deburga do, and using terror skills to unnerve, which is again the howling, the banging of the swords and the shields, their Celtic technique when they're in battle of playing their carnixes, those gargantuan great trumpets that make this very discordant noise and dozens of them blowing away. It's frightening again. If you can psychologically unnerve your enemy, then either they run away and therefore you don't need to attack them, or they're so scared they make stupid mistakes and they're much easier to take down. So fear as a psychological tactic, fear as a weapon of war to unnerve unman, unwoman, whatever word you want to call it, terrify your enemy. All of that kind of meaning and subtext comes up in Arthur. It's not a cuddly, jolly stave to come up in a reading. It's a warning of risk and threat and danger and the need to protect yourself, to put that defensive barrier up, which includes not only locks on the doors and burglar alarms in the house, but maybe psychological tactics to frighten off people who would do you harm. I think that's probably enough on this one. Next time we'll move on to Dur, the oak tree. But that's enough now. Thank you.